Chapter 9. Western Philosophies. In the preceding chapters, we have traced certain tendencies in modern thought back to the transcendental movement of which Emerson was the high priest and prophet, thence back to the philosophies of ancient Greece, and thence back to the Oriental philosophies. We must now begin our return journey to the present time. But in order to lend variety to the trip, and in order to become acquainted with the other roads which lead to the Rome of modern thought, we shall forsake the path of transcendentalism over which we traveled on our outward journey, and shall return home by the road of the Western philosophers. This road, like that of transcendentalism, extends from the schools of old India, via ancient Greece, to the schools of popular modern thought in the Western world of the 20th century. By the term, the Western philosophers, I wish to indicate the leaders and pioneers of philosophical thought from, say, the beginning of the 17th century to the present time. Before the Western philosophers, and after the Grecian philosophers, came the school of patristic philosophy, beginning at about the 2nd century, the teachers of which were the fathers of the Church. The patristic philosophy was in the nature of an effort to reconcile the early Christian theology with the older Grecian philosophical conceptions, Neoplatonism and Gnosticism playing an important part in the intellectual struggle. After the patristic school came that of the scholastic philosophy, the central figure of the division being St. Augustine, who died 430 A.D. The scholastic philosophy was a strange mingling of medieval philosophical thought under the domination of the orthodox theology, having for its aim the exposition of the dogmas of the Church in the terminology of rational philosophical inquiry. This school was characterized by extreme and often excessive subtlety of expression and refinement of reasoning, and the making of formal distinctions without end and without special point. As an authority says, scholasticism was the reproduction of ancient philosophy under the control of the ecclesiastical discipline, the former being accommodated to the latter in case of any discrepancy between them. The first period of the scholastic philosophy extended to the beginning of the 13th century, at which time the influence of the old Aristotelian philosophy began to reassert itself by reason of the appearance of the writings of Aristotle in Western Europe. The second period of the scholastic philosophy extended from this time until the Renaissance in the 15th century, and was marked by the adaptation of the whole Aristotelian philosophy to orthodox theology, the doctrine of Aristotle becoming the basis of the theoretical philosophy of the Church. The high watermark of scholasticism was in the early part of the 14th century, the Renaissance. Succeeding the scholastic philosophy came that of the Renaissance, that remarkable period of the transition from the thought of the Middle Ages to that of modern times, that strange reawakening or rebirth of thought, art, and letters. This period extended over the 15th and 16th centuries. The philosophy of the Renaissance was notable for the marked revival of the influence of Plato in Neoplatonism, which, as usual, resulted in breaking up the crystallized forms of orthodox philosophy and theology, and giving to thought the tinge of mysticism and transcendentalism. Neoplatonism seems to reappear at regular intervals of time in philosophical thought, and always with a disturbing influence. It is now manifesting in modern thought in the usual way, as we have seen in the preceding chapters of this work. At the time of the Renaissance, it served to break and disintegrate the scholastic philosophy, and fit it in with the trend toward the study of nature's processes which the thought of that time had began to favor. As an authority says, Platonism flourished in the Academy of Florence. Neoplatonism blended with Neo-Pythagoreanism. Aristotelianism renewed its vigor in the two rival schools of Averroism and Alexandrism, and among the Protestants in Melanchthon. The disturbances in thought at the time of the Renaissance were very similar to that of the present time, and the two periods invite comparison and comparative study. What I have called the Western philosophies sprang from the fertile soil of the Renaissance, and by the beginning of the 17th century was showing blossom and bearing fruit. I think that I can give a better view of the various influences at work from that time on by asking you to consider briefly the ideas and teachings of the representative teachers of the period, rather than to treat the thought as a whole. So many conflicting elements appear that it is difficult to consider it in the latter way. The Baconian philosophy, perhaps it would be best to begin the story of the Western philosophers by a consideration of Francis Bacon, that brilliant though eccentric genius, whose power is becoming manifest more clearly as time passes. Francis Bacon was an Englishman who lived A.D. 1561 to 1629. At Cambridge he became disgusted with Aristotle's philosophy, which was accepted almost as final by many of the thinkers of the time. He laid the foundation of modern empiricism, or the doctrine that truth is to be sought actual experience. He opposed the deductive or a priori speculations of the scholastics, the speculations which from an assumed general principle or explanation proceeded to particular truths, and favored the reasoning which, from actual facts gathered by experience, proceeded to general principles resulting from the same. He insisted that instead of nature being studied from theories or dogmas concerning the divine nature, it should be known by an examination of her phenomena, without bias, and that possibly even ultimate truth itself might be ascertained from this knowledge of facts of experience. The Baconian method is defined as the method of investigating experience which proceeds from given particular facts, and applies to general conceptions that have not themselves been gained from and tested by comparison with particulars. This method of reasoning laid the basis for the scientific discoveries which have followed, and did much to direct thought toward physics and away from metaphysics in its search for truth. An authority says, "The great triumphs of modern science have arisen from a resolute adherence on the part of its votaries to the Baconian method of inquiry." Another says, "It is the Baconian spirit of going direct to nature and verifying our opinions and theories by experiment that has led to all the great discoveries of modern science. And it is Bacon's spirit which has caused the change in metaphysical and philosophical thought, compelling it to take scientific facts and experience into consideration in arriving at general principles, instead of boldly assuming the general principle as truth, and then attempting to account for the phenomena of nature in accordance with the assumed principle. The philosophy of today must be based upon observed facts and items of experience. For this we have Bacon to thank."
Bruno.
Giordano Bruno, an Italian philosopher who lived a.d. 1548 to 1600, exerted a lasting influence on later philosophy, although his name has never been accorded its true place in the history of philosophy. He was originally a priest, but was driven out of the church by reason of his philosophical views, and finally was burned at the stake by the Inquisition when he refused to recant. A statue, erected by his modern admirers, now stands upon the exact place of his execution in Rome, where it was erected in spite of the protests of the Vatican. His philosophy was a mystic pantheism, with a poetical personification of nature. He held that there is an all-life, animating the whole universe, which thus is seen to be an universal living being. This universal living being has two aspects, the one called natura naturans, or God, who manifests himself in the visible world of phenomena, which is called natura naturata, or nature. He held that la God all the seeming inconsistencies of the material world are harmonized, and the apparent evil becomes good. He held that every part of the universe is animated with the life of the whole, and that there is no dead or non-living thing in the world. He held that there is no form without matter, and that as spirit or soul is the essence of form, it could manifest only in material embodiment. His philosophy exerted a marked influence on later modern pantheistic or naturalistic thought, and also upon the systems of Descartes, Spinoza, Bohm, Hegel, and others, and in a measure upon the latest conceptions of monistic thought and evidence at the present time. The Cartesian philosophy. René Descartes was a French philosopher who lived a.d. 1596 to 1650. He is often called the father of modern philosophy. He was reared in a Jesuit college, but became dissatisfied with the prevailing teachings of scholasticism and determined to abandon books and to clear his mind of what he had learned, and then begin his philosophical thought afresh. Discarding everything, he found that thought still remained, and that he was conscious of his own existence, or the awareness of I am. Thus arose his famous proposition, I think, therefore I am. Inquiring next into ideas, or all that is in our mind when we conceive a thing, in whatever way we conceive it, he regarded clearness and distinctness as the criterion of the true as distinguished from the false. He held that the clearest idea in the human mind is the idea of God. Therefore, there must he a God. Similarly, he reasoned that God must he an absolutely perfect being, and that such a being could not deceive us in mathematical and metaphysical reasoning faculties, and that therefore these sciences must be trustworthy. From this he reasoned that the actual existence of the phenomenal world is proved by the prior truth of the existence of God. He held that there exists spirit and matter, thinking and extended substance, and that creation was and is a manifestation of divine will. He was practically the founder of the modern school of rationalism, or the doctrine that reason is an independent source of knowledge, distinct from sense perception and having a higher authority, and that in philosophy, certain elementary concepts are to be sought, and that the remaining principles of philosophy may be deduced from these fundamental notions. His philosophy was very popular during the latter half of the 17th and the whole of the 18th century. His ideas were developed by Spinoza and Leibniz, and were finally refuted by Kant, who held that from concepts could be deduced only that which had previously been put in them, and that rational concepts must be applied to the material of sense gained through experience. Rationalism, however, still exists in philosophy in a modified form. Even Kant, who gave it its death blow as a perfect method, endeavoring to combine its truths with those of empiricism, or the doctrine that truth is to be sought only through experience. Spinoza. Baruch Spinoza, a Dutch Jew, who lived a.d. 1632 to 1677, was one of the greatest philosophers of modern times. Excommunicated from the Jewish faith and persecuted in many ways, he supported himself by grinding lenses. His character was admirable, and he stands out in history as one of the most sincere and consistent of philosophers. His system was a complicated pantheism. He held that all things were of one substance, and that substance existed independently of any external cause or power. Consequently, that substance must be God. By substance, however, Spinoza did not mean matter or material principle, but the underlying reality, or the self-sufficient and comprehensive basis for, or es8 is of, all reality, capable at the same time of manifesting as its attributes all temporal and phenomenal existence. He held to the possibility of an infinite number of attributes in substance, but that only two binds were known to us, namely, the attribute of extension, or matter, and the attribute of thinking, or mind. These two attributes were held to be parallel manifestations or attributes of the hidden substantial reality of God. All particular things, psychical or physical, are modes of God, according to Spinoza, and bear the same relation to him as does the stream to the ocean, or time to eternity. God, he held, was the natura naturans, and nature the natura naturata. Each one the energy, the other the act. The modes he held to be ephemeral, while God is eternal, outlasting all changes of time or space. He taught that only by identification with the eternal verities, with substance, with God, can immortality, or peace, be obtained. Spinoza founded no school, but his spirit lives in nearly all philosophies since his time. Even Haeckel, the modern scientific monistic authority, freely acknowledges his indebtedness to the Jewish philosopher. Spinoza's spirit is evidenced in his axiom, to define God is to deny him. Lewis says of him, neither in Holland nor in Germany has there been a Spinozist, as there have been Cartesians, Kantists, and Hegelians, although German philosophy is in some sense saturated with Spinozism. Leibniz. Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz was a German philosopher who lived a.d. 1646 to 1716. He was influenced largely by Descartes regarding the doctrine of innate ideas, by Spinoza regarding rationalism, and by Locke regarding individualism. He held that nothing comes to the soul from without, but that all knowledge is merely an unfoldment of ideas originally possessed and innate, as the small, dark notions of the soul. All ideas are innate and not acquired, although the explicit consciousness of them is acquired. He holds to an infinite substance, but breaks its unity up into an infinite number of monads. His reality exists in itself, but acts through its monads. The monads, or souls, he holds, have the whole universe mirrored in themselves. The nature of each monad is held to be the same, but they vary infinitely in their degrees of perception, the most obscure perception belonging to the monads which we call matter. While God is pure activity, the finite monads are in a state of imperfect realization, the passivity of the finite monads giving rise to the illusion of the material world. He held that God is the monad of monads, and his influence causes the changes of the finite monads to harmonize. Leibniz was a radical optimist, holding that the universe was the best of all possible universes, having been selected as such by God by reason of his infinite wisdom mid-goodness. He did not assert that the universe was perfect, but that as a whole the world was the best of all possible worlds, and that for this reason God was justified for selecting a world in which there was evil. The followers of Leibniz sacrificed his fundamental principles, as above stated, and held merely to his rationalistic methods, the result being to reduce the philosophy to its scholastic form. The result was the decline of dogmatic rationalism. A new school, that of empiricism, was beginning to wage war on the rationalists, and a new era in philosophy was dawning. Locke. John Locke was an English philosopher who lived a.d. 1632 to 1704. He was the founder of the modern school of philosophy known as empiricism, the principal doctrine of which is that all knowledge or truth is to be obtained only through experience, as opposed to the theory of innate ideas. Locke developed the Baconian idea that experience was the true source of knowledge, and that general truths should be reasoned inductively from observed feats of experience. He held that in empirical facts we may find the only source of knowledge, since the mind has no innate ideas. His teaching was that the materials for thought and reason are impressed upon the mind from outside, and that the sole activity of the mind is that of linking and combining together the ideas so obtained. He argued from this that our knowledge of the external world, resting, as it does, upon sense perception, must be merely upon the plane of probability. He, however, violated his fundamental principle by assuming a rationalistic ideal, including the assertion that we have intuitive knowledge of the existence of the self, the existence of God, and of mathematical and moral truths. While under the influence of Bacon, he was nevertheless largely influenced by the rationalism of Descartes. While apparently advancing the full doctrine of empiricism, he managed to point out the way for its reconciliation with rationalism, which way was pursued by Kant in after years. Hume. David Hume, a Scotch philosopher, a.d. 1711 to 1776, afterward carried Locke's fundamental theories to their logical conclusion and held that there was not knowable other than conscious experiences, that is, impressions and their reflection, ideas. Hume held that we cannot transcend this knowledge, although we may combine the ideas by association, etc., according to the established principles of psychology. Hume taught that we cannot prove the existence of God, of self, or of matter, all of which ideas are the illusions of imagination, having no basis in actual experience. He earned empiricism to the realm of pure skepticism. Berkeley. George Berkeley was a bishop of the Church of England, who lived a.d. 1685 to 1753. He was the founder of the modern school of idealism, which system he developed largely upon the basis of Locke, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. He held that matter cannot be conceived to actually exist, the only real substance being mind, and that the material world is nothing but a complex of mental impressions which appear and disappear in accordance with established laws of nature. He held that the reality of sense objects consisted in their being perceived, and that the assumption of an object apart from its idea is fallacious. He denied the individual existence of object apart from the subjective idea of it, and of both subject and object apart from the mind of God, or the Absolute. He held that, there being no real external world, the phenomena of sense must depend upon God continually, necessitating perception. Berkeley set out to prove the existence of God by his idealistic theory, but reasoned in a circle when he assumed the existence of God to make his theory tenable. His opponents endeavored to confute him by the familiar illustration of one kicking a stone and realizing the reality of the effect produced, but he and his followers logically explained that the said effect was merely a sensation known by the mind, and not a thing outside of the mind. Idealism, in various forms, has permeated many later philosophical systems. Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel have made the doctrine parts of their respective system, and it is heard from in the metaphysical systems and theories of today. Kant. Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, lived a.d. 1724 to 1804. His work created a new era in modern philosophy and has profoundly affected all subsequent philosophical thought, even in systems which are apparently opposed to his fundamental principles. He was the founder of the modern school of critical philosophy. He, following the skepticism of Hume as to the idea of causality, enunciated the proposition that the faculty of knowledge and the sources of knowledge must be critically examined before anything could be definitely determined regarding objective truth. He aimed to separate the intuitive or a priori mental forms from those obtained empirically or through experience, and also to define and determine the limits of human reason and the knowledge obtained therefrom. He attributed to the faculties of sense, understanding, judgment, and reason certain innate ideas, intuitive truths, or a priori forms, which must be valid and real because of their necessity, as, for instance, the ideas of time and space, cause and effect, action and reaction, reality, unity, the idea of the absolute, and certain moral truths, such as his famous categorical imperative, which held as axiomatic the idea that one should act only on that maxim whereby thou canst at the same time. Well, that it should become a universal law, the latter being claimed by him to be a moral law which admits of no condition or exception. He held that theoretical knowledge was limited, as much as the universal ideas existing in the mind would yield knowledge only when excited thereto by the presentation of their corresponding objects in actual experience, and that even then what we really know is not the thing in itself, but merely the thing as it appears, the phenomenon, not the noumenon. The result of his reasoning is that certain things in themselves must be unknowable, as they can never appear to the mind as objects of actual experience and consciousness, and are to be thought of only as belonging to the noumenal, or the world of things in themselves. These unknowable things are the transcendental thought postulates in psychology, cosmology, and theology, as, for instance, God, freedom, and immortality of the soul, and the opposites or contradictions which reason meets in considering the ideas of infinity as infinite time, infinite space, infinite chain of cause and effect. As an authority says of Kant's teachings, his point is that though it is unquestionably necessary to be convinced of God's existence, it is not so necessary to demonstrate it. He shows that all such demonstrations are scientifically impossible and worthless. On the great questions of metaphysics, immortality, freedom, God, scientific knowledge is hopeless. It will be seen that Kant ambitiously essayed to harmonize and blend the opposing principles of rationalism and empiricism, of a priori and a posteriori knowledge, of innate ideas and ideas arising from experience. He held that knowledge is composed of two factors, as follows. 1. A priori, innate in the mind itself, antedating experience and necessary to make experience possible. And 2. A posteriori, coming from without, as the raw material of sensation through experience. He held that the a priori knowledge is not usable without the material of sense experience, and that the a posteriori knowledge would fail to take form in consciousness were it not for the mold ideas innately existing in the mind. He held, therefore, that while theoretical reason or scientific inquiry is necessarily limited to the realm of experience and phenomenon, still practical reason is valid in postulating belief in the moral law and order, and belief in the existence of a world of transcendental reality. Practical reason, he held, made it necessary for us to postulate the existence of God, freedom, and immortality, and to manifest our belief in our moral life, although pure reason was absolutely unable to demonstrate their existence. Thus did Kant endeavor to build a structure of faith upon a foundation of reason. Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who lived a.d. 1770 to 1831, was one of the greatest and most influential of the modern German philosophers. His philosophy is known as that of absolute idealism. It is almost impossible to state his philosophy in popular terms and in a limited space, so subtle and complicated is his thought and so voluminous the expression thereof. The following brief synopsis, therefore, must be accepted only with the above understanding. Hegel was a rationalist of the most extreme type, although his expression differed from that of the English philosophers of that school, and his conceptions blended rationalism with idealism in a striking manner. He held that reality is but a manifestation of mind, and mind a manifestation of reality. The universe, he held, is the product of thought, and its life and activities are those of thought. Nature is petrified intelligence. History, he held, is but the record of the process of absolute spirit toward complete self-realization. Mind, or reason, is all there is. The real is rational and the rational is real, be said. He held that in knowing what is we knew reason, for reason is all that is. He held that progress, in reality, is an illusion, and that the consummation of the infinite end consists merely in removing the illusion which makes it seem still unaccomplished. The idea makes itself that illusion by setting up an antithesis to confront itself, and its acting consists in getting rid of the illusion which it has created. He also held that the motive force of the world development was opposition and negation. Everything is what it is by reason of what it is not, and everything, therefore, both is and is not at the same time, and can be understood only by combining the is and the is not in a higher synthesis. But he is careful to state, the contradictories are not annulled when combined, but are merely conserved, though when thus conserved they are no longer contradictory. By this process of reasoning, Hegel held that being and not being are one. From an union of and conservation of these two contradictories, he obtained the idea of becoming. After Hegel's death, his followers divided into opposing schools, each claiming to truly represent his thought, although diametrically opposed to each other. To such radical extremes was Hegelism carried by his followers that his system fell into disfavor in Germany, although at present it is experiencing a revival in England and America under the name of Neo-Hegelism and in some of the New Thought. Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, who was an active opponent, philosophically and personally, of Hegel, lived a.d. 1788 to 1860. To many he is known as the apostle of pessimism, although his general philosophy has attracted great attention, particularly in Germany. His general philosophy is known as voluntarism, or the doctrine that ultimate reality is to be conceived of as an universal will, instead of an universal reason. He held that reality, or the universal thing in itself, is the principle of will, which manifests itself in various degrees and phases as physical, chemical, magnetic, and vital force in nature. Its most striking phase, however, being the will to live, which manifests through all living forms, seeking expression and objective life. The will to live, he held, is instinctive rather than rational, and acts as blind nature in the struggles to perpetuate life, in the struggle for existence and the reproduction of the species. He claimed that the instinct of self-preservation and of sexual attraction is but the urge of the will to live, seeking channels of expression. He held that reason is merely a byproduct of will, an excrescence, so to speak, and that reason cannot expect to apprehend reality, for the latter is will. The force of intellect, he holds, is inferior to that of the will, and is subordinated to the latter, eventually, whenever, as often happens, the two come in conflict. In will, he claims, we view nature from the inside, while in intellect we view her from the outside. The phenomenal world he regards as merely presentation to the will, in fact, an illusion similar to the Maya of the Hindus. Schopenhauer, in fact, was a Western Buddhist, and his philosophy follows that latter school in many essential details. Schopenhauer held that the world spirit, which he calls will, does not act according to reason, but rather by caprice, instigated by a desire or lust for expression. His will is ever at work building up, tearing down, replacing, repairing, changing, always at work, always acting, always doing. It is ever filled with intense longing to express itself into shape and form and force, ever desiring change. Finally, it develops self, consciousness, and reason in man, and then turns its gaze inward upon itself, studying its own nature through man's philosophy and metaphysics. In man, the instinctive will rises to reason, and for the first time is able to control its own instinctive nature. In creating intellect, the will forges an instrument destined to master and conquer itself. This, briefly, is Schopenhauer's conception of the world spirit, derived largely from Buddhistic sources, and destined to play an important part in later Western thought. Von Hartmann. Edward von Hartmann, 1842 to 1906, the German philosopher, built largely upon Schopenhauer's foundation, although differing from him greatly in his final conclusions. He accepted Schopenhauer's idea of the world spirit, ever at work building up and tearing down, ever seeking change in shape, form, and manifestation of force. But he held that the conception of will without rational idea was illogical and unthinkable, just as Hegel's conception of rational idea without will was illogical. He thereupon seeks to harmonize and reconcile the two conceptions. He postulates the existence of a world spirit in which will and rational idea are combined as the two phases, or two poles, just as the color and perfume of the rose are complementary and essential. But he holds that the rational idea phase of the world spirit is unconscious, and in fact, he applies the term the unconscious to his conception of the world spirit. This unconscious spirit he pictures as using its powers of ideation and will in the work of objective manifestation, ever at work creating new shapes and forms and manifesting change and variety. Like a somnambulist, it proceeds with its work, according to logical ideas, instinctively but according to the laws of rationality. Finally, the unconscious manifests consciousness, and then self-consciousness in man, and may even proceed to higher forms of consciousness in higher beings yet to be evolved. But, in itself, it is unconscious and must ever remain so, its only consciousness being obtained through its created manifestation. Such is von Hartmann's conception of the unconscious world spirit. His conception of unconscious mind has been used, often without due credit, but later writers and investigators of the subliminal mind, the subjective mind, the subconscious mind, etc., in man. It is very probable that his philosophy will be developed in greater detail by future philosophers and workers along the lines of psychic research. Nietzsche. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, that brilliant but erratic German philosopher whose extreme and radical conceptions have startled the modern world of thought, flamed into the sky of philosophy like a comet and disappeared therefrom in like manner. Brilliant to an extreme, he spent his mental energy in running around the circle of thought until he was exhausted, and insanity brought his work to an end. Building upon the foundation of Schopenhauer and influenced to a degree by von Hartmann, he conceived the idea of a world spirit which is ever striving to achieve power in objective manifestation, shape, and form through evolution. He held that the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest, as taught by the evolutionists, is a cosmic law, and rightly so, for it serves to bring out the strongest and fittest of the manifestations of the will, or world spirit. He carried the principles of Darwin into the field of ethics and conduct, holding that nature has given us direct teaching upon the subject, and that might is right, and that it is to the heat interest of the race that the strong conquer and persist, and the weak go to the wall and be destroyed. From this struggle and survival, he held, will rise the overman, in whose evolution man is but an instrument and a step. He denounces Christian morality as the morality of slaves, tending to develop and preserve the weak, and thus interfere with the purposes of the will. To him the strong is ever the good. But inconsistent, as are nearly all thinkers, his teaching contains within itself a strong trace of altruism, for does he not teach that we, the race of men, are to model our morals, ethics, and lives upon the idea and for the purpose of producing and evolving the overman? By many he is regarded as the prophet of a terrible doctrine of extreme egoism, but later writers are beginning to see in him but the teacher of a rigid, stern, and cruel creed, having for its purpose the upbuilding of a strong and powerful race or species of overmen. His elemental cruelty and lack of sympathy has made his teaching very repellent to those who are in sympathy with the humanitarian spirit of the age. By such his teaching is regarded as monstrous. But, to others, he seems to have but overemphasized one phase of the evolutionary urge. Shaw. To many, the mention of the name of George Bernard Shaw, born 1856, in a list of modern philosophers may seem strange. So accustomed are the majority of persons to think of this erratic genius as a playwright, essayist, critic, and sociologist. But Bernard Shaw has a philosophy which he subtly introduces in his writings without specifically claiming it to be such. His idea of a fundamental something is expressed by his term, the life forces, which he considers as manifesting very much in the same way as does Schopenhauer's will to live, von Hartmann's unconscious, or Bergson's life principle. He does not tell us just what the life forces are in themselves or in itself. In fact, he at times seems to express the idea that they cannot be known abstractly or independent from objective manifestation. But, at any rate, his life forces seem to be seeking along the lines of evolution for higher and more fitter forms of expression, testing and trying first this path, and then that one, often finding themselves in a blind alley or cul-de-sac, and then retreating therefrom only to try another path. Shaw has even intimated that in man the life forces may have run up a cul-de-sac and may be compelled to beat a retreat after a time. Like Nietzsche, Bernard Shaw has a dream of a future greater man, which he calls the Superman, toward the production of whom the life forces are striving. Bergson. Henri Bergson, the French philosopher and author of the recent work entitled Creative Evolution, is one of the latest stars noted in the philosophical firmament. A recent English critic has said of his latest work that, than its entrance upon the field as a well-armed and militant philosophy, there have been not many more memorable occurrences in the world of ideas. Another authority says, the influence of Bergson is a distinct feature of a new interest in philosophy of which there is abundant evidence in every country. The enthusiasm he has gathered around him is due in the first place to the originality of his speculation, and in the second place, and in a much greater degree, to the promise it offers of raising philosophy to a position in regard to human life and knowledge which has never yet been accorded to it. Whether or not this enthusiastic praise is warranted by the facts must be decided during the next few years when Bergson's philosophy is tried out by the fire of criticism to which it will be subjected. This philosophy has been called the New Idealism, but it is something more, or perhaps less, than this. He describes ultimate reality as being in the nature of a psychical life principle. He holds the reality is the principle of life, itself not an absolute afar off, but a living something, near to and within us. The intellect is merely a phenomenon of this life principle. The following quotation from H. Wilden Carr, in the Hibbert Journal, will give a clear, thorough, brief, general idea of Bergson's conception of the life principle. Reality is a flux. Life is creative evolution. Evolution, as we study it in the records of the history that it has left and in the variety of modes in which it has manifested appearance as a succession of forms. Types and species seem to endure for a time and then to give place to other types and species, but there is not real halting. Evolution is a continuous change. Life is not static. Something now that once was something different, a past left behind and a future spread out in front. It is a single continuous movement, carrying all its past with it and pressing forward into a future which it is forever creating. Evolution is the original impetus of life, the living act in progress. It manifests itself in ever-varying circumstances. The various powers of living beings are the means by which the life activity advances. Of these powers, two are especially notable: instinct and intelligence. The former has reached its highest perfection along the line of the invertebrate, especially in ants and bees, and the latter has reached its highest perfection in man. In Bergson's view, the intellect is a nucleus formed by a contraction or narrowing of the power of consciousness, and around it is a fringe of more comprehensive consciousness. It is in the possession of this fringe that our power of intuition lies. The intellect has been constructed by the life movement to serve the practical purpose of directing the activities of the living beings possessed of it. Its practical usefulness is due to its limitations. So far as knowledge is concerned, there is insistence that the intellect is neither supreme, nor absolute, nor the only form of knowledge. Intuition is not comparable with the intellect as regards the nature and extent of the knowledge that it puts at our command. Our practical knowledge is entirely intellectual. But, nevertheless, intuition is a fact, and we have positive evidence of it in ourselves. And a study of other modes of animal existence seems to show that it exists as the normal faculty of knowledge and instinct. Unfortunately, from the point of view of pair theory, it is a kind of knowing that, however perfect in its exercise, is apparently limited in its scope. There are things that intelligence alone is able to seek, but that by itself it will never find. Those things instinct alone could find, but it will never seek them. Now on to the present tendency. Thus we see the present tendency is toward the conception of a world spirit, or living universe, constantly manifesting itself in forms, shapes, and forces. Under the various names used by the later philosophers, we may always find this fundamental conception. At the base of all these conceptions is to be found that which may as well be called spirit as by any other term. Voluntarism, in modified forms, is exerting a strong influence in certain quarters of modern philosophical thought and in general literature. It is especially attractive to those who have graduated from materialism, but who find no sympathy for rationalistic idealism. It will probably play an important part in the philosophy of the present century, probably as the active opponent of the schools of rationalistic idealism, just as Schopenhauer was the active opponent of Hegel, the founder of the school of absolute idealism. Supplant the word will by the term spirit and attach the latter to Schopenhauer's philosophy, and we have an agreement with several schools of advanced thought, metaphysics of today, also with Fechner 8 animistic pantheism, and Wundt's conception of the universe as the outer wrapper or sheath, behind which is hidden a spiritual creative activity, a striving, feeling, sensing, like that which we experience in ourselves, the active principle of which is conation or impulse, tendency, desire, and will. Now on to materialism. One of the most striking incidents of the history of philosophy is that of the rapid rise into popularity of the doctrine of materialism in the middle of the 19th century. This probably came as a reaction from the extreme emphasis upon idealism manifested by the German philosophers during the previous century. Molschat, Voigt, and Biener were the leaders of this school. Their fundamental doctrine was that the facts of the universe were sufficiently explained by the assumption that matter was the fundamental constituent or ultimate fact of the universe, and that all phenomena, including that of consciousness, could be reduced to the transformation of material molecules. Matter was conceived of as extended, impenetrable, eternally existent, and susceptible of change of relative position. For a few decades, radical materialism flourished, but has since given way to other conceptions. Agnosticism has largely succeeded it, and in fact, the former school is often identified in the popular mind with materialism, although it differs materially from that school. On to agnosticism. Agnosticism, which sprang into favor during the latter half of the 19th century, has for its fundamental doctrine the idea that it is impossible for the human mind to acquire knowledge about God or the absolute, or in fact of anything transcending experience. Herbert Spencer and Huxley were the leaders in the modern agnostic movement. It has become popular because it easily fits in with the investigations of modern science and the speculations arising therefrom. While both Huxley and Spencer recognize the co-equal reality of mind and matter, their emphasis of the material side has caused many to identify their philosophy with materialism, which belief is unwarranted. Spencer's position that reality, in itself, is unknowable, and that all things are manifestations of that infinite and eternal energy from which all things proceed, and which transcends both our reason and our imagination, gives a clear idea of the fundamental position of modern agnosticism. Scientific monism. While, as an authority says, materialism as a dogmatic system hardly survives in philosophical circles, although, in alliance with secularism and socialism, it is no doubt influential among certain sections and classes, and often forms the creed of the half-educated specialist. The place of materialism has been taken by scientific monism, which, however, in some of its representatives, seems often to be but slightly differentiated from the materialism which it has superseded. Scientific monism is the doctrine that the universe is the manifestation of a single principle of nature. Ernst Haeckel, the German scientist, is the leading exponent of modern scientific monism. He holds that the fundamental reality consists of a principle of substance, of which matter and force are two aspects, and in which mind is immanent and manifest in varying degrees from the atom to man. He also holds that the entire universe of matter is instinct with life, but inasmuch as he denies immortality and identifies the soul with material form, by some he is classed as an extreme materialist. By many, however, his system is thought likely to evolve into a conception in which materialism and idealism may meet on common ground. In fact, in one of his latest lectures, Haeckel admits that his principle of substance may as well be known as spirit as by any other term. This admission is wonderfully significant to close students of his philosophy. Now a section on positivism versus idealism. The rapid development of scientific thought and investigation. The new conceptions of matter and force, the theory of evolution, and the thought that has evolved from these sources has tended to give to modern philosophy a decided trend toward positivism, or the doctrine which holds that philosophical thought must be limited to the data and methods of the natural sciences. This doctrine is diametrically opposed to the methods of metaphysics, which is now manifesting its fullest flower in monistic idealism. And in these two opposing schools, we find the secret of the present-day conflict in modern thought. On one aid is the extreme all-mind doctrine, and on the other the spirit of natural science, each striving to carry off the prize of philosophy. The struggle is now on, and the dust of the battle somewhat obscures our sight. But through it all, I think I see the approaching figure of a mediator who will show the combatants that they are not enemies, but really are brothers in arms.